You really don't know who I am, do you? James Carter said, his voice calm but firm, his words cutting through the air like a blade. The security guard, Richard, stood frozen, blocking the gate of James' sprawling mansion. The man who owned this entire estate, every inch of land, every polished marble floor inside, was being held at the entrance, as if he were an intruder. James had been through more than anyone could imagine to get to this point. He had worked for years, building an empire, a legacy of wealth and power. But standing here, on his own property, being turned away like a criminal, it stung in ways he couldn't explain. Richard, young and brash, clearly didn't recognize James. "Sir, you can't come in without the proper clearance," Richard said, his tone dismissive, as though he were speaking to a common delivery driver. James' eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching slightly, but he didn't flinch. He was no stranger to moments like this. He had faced prejudice, doubt, and underestimation since he was young, but he had never been this insulted before. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I own this place, Richard," James said, his words dripping with a quiet authority. "This is my home." Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with suspicion, as if trying to determine whether James was bluffing. His eyes scanned James' simple attire, an unassuming black t-shirt and jeans, nothing flashy. But James knew this was part of the test. He had dressed down intentionally. No Rolex, no designer suit, just a man who had earned every inch of his success, and now, his identity was being questioned. Richard didn't back down. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're not on the list. Please leave." James' fingers hovered over the phone in his pocket. He could feel the calm but rising tension in his chest, the sense of injustice that had followed him for years. But he wasn't going to react like they expected him to. Instead, he dialed his assistant, Nia, without saying a word. She picked up immediately, her voice calm and professional. "It's happening," James said, his tone still measured. "Activate Protocol 7. He didn't have to say more. Nia knew exactly what to do. He set the phone down and looked up at Richard, who was now visibly uneasy. "You really don't know who I am?" James asked again, his voice low but unwavering. Richard stood there, his posture defensive, eyes darting around as though hoping someone would come to his rescue. He didn't know who James was, didn't know that he owned not just the mansion in front of him, but the entire company that had revolutionized multiple industries. Richard had no idea that the mansion he was guarding, every inch of this land, was James' legacy, his empire. Richard finally sighed and crossed his arms. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't let you in. You'll have to go." James didn't move. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to shout. He had done too much to get to this point, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away. He just stared at Richard, his eyes sharp. It was a power that came from within, from years of being underestimated, years of proving himself, years of building something from nothing. "You're not going anywhere," Richard continued, his tone now tinged with arrogance. He made a move to open the gate, stepping toward James, but James didn't budge. "I'll say it one last time," James said, his voice even cold. "I own this place." Just then, Richard's walkie-talkie crackled with a call from the other guard. "Richard, what's going on out there? Is everything okay?" Richard's hand hovered over the device, but he didn't respond immediately. James could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't going as planned. James took another breath, steadying himself. He wasn't going to let this moment define him, but he wasn't going to let this slip by either. He didn't have to shout, didn't have to raise his voice. All he had to do was be still and let the truth settle in. Moments later, the sound of a car pulling up echoed in the distance. Nia was here. The security system began to hum softly. James pulled out his phone again, quickly sending a few messages. "Prepare for a full audit of the security team," he typed to Nia. "Take care of Richard and his team. Make sure this never happens again." Within seconds, Nia confirmed, and James watched as Richard's badge blinked red, his access revoked, all privileges stripped. Richard glanced down at his badge, confusion spreading across his face. He stepped back, his feet heavy with disbelief. James remained calm, but there was a flicker of satisfaction behind his eyes. "You're fired," James said simply. Richard stood there, unable to process what had just happened. He looked at the gate, at James, at the crowd now gathered in the distance, and then back to his walkie-talkie. What just happened?" he muttered, but no one responded. They didn't have to. They already knew. James didn't have to explain who he was. He didn't need to show off. He simply stood there, the quiet embodiment of power and authority. The guards, the staff, the workers, they were all a part of his world, and now, they would learn what it meant to truly hold the keys to that world. "You're done here," James said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the driveway. Richard turned, his face pale, but it was too late. James had already made his point. The gate creaked open. Richard stepped back as James drove past him, the engine of his car humming, filling the silence with a deep, satisfying roar. He had reclaimed his space. He had proven his power. And he had done it all without lifting a finger in anger. This wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. James Carter had just shown them that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand tall and speak the truth. And when you do, everyone will listen. James drove slowly through the open gate, the tires of his black sports car rolling over the smooth, wide driveway of his mansion. The grand estate loomed ahead, the kind of place most people could only dream of. Every inch of it was his. The sprawling lawns, the beautiful fountains, and the towering columns at the entrance. Yet today, fragile in the hands of those who didn't understand it. As he pulled into his garage, the sound of the door closing behind him felt like a weight lifting off his chest. But there was no time to relax. James had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the loudest form of protest. And today, he was making his statement. He got out of the car and stood still for a moment, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows over the land he had built, the land he had earned. But it wasn't enough to just own it. He had to prove that he belonged here, that no one could question his place anymore. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He dialed Nia's number without hesitation. The call was picked up almost immediately. "Nia, I need everything documented," James said, his voice still calm. "I want the entire security team to be reviewed. Every move, every word. I'll send you the details in a minute. Make sure Richard's access is revoked immediately." He didn't wait for a response. He knew Nia would take care of it. She was efficient, quick, and always handled things with the utmost professionalism. But this was personal. James walked toward the entrance of the mansion, his mind racing with thoughts. The injustice he had faced today was just one moment in a long series of challenges he had overcome. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about making a statement. He stepped inside the grand foyer, the marble floors shining beneath him. He looked up at the towering chandelier above, its crystal facets reflecting the soft glow of the lights. It was beautiful, and it was his. But something about the way Richard had treated him, the way he had been dismissed so easily, made the beauty feel hollow for a moment. James couldn't let it slide. He knew what he had to do. The phone in his hand buzzed. It was Nia. "Everything's been logged, James. Richard's access has been locked. The audit's already in progress." James nodded, though Nia couldn't see it. "Good. I want a full review of all employees involved. This doesn't stop with Richard. This is about making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. No one gets to treat me like that again." He paused, looking out of the large windows that lined the walls of the mansion. The sun had almost set now, the sky painted in hues of pink and purple. It was peaceful, yet his mind was far from it. He had worked too hard for this, for everything he had. And for someone like Richard to undermine him like that, he couldn't let it go. He wouldn't. Nia's voice came through again. "I've sent the details to HR and legal. Everything's in motion." James smiled faintly. "Good. Keep me updated." He hung up the phone and turned to face the grand staircase leading up to the second floor. But as his eyes traveled over the polished railings and the golden fixtures that adorned the walls, he knew that this mansion, this empire, wasn't just about luxury. It was about power and respect, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. He walked up the staircase, each step measured, each one more resolute than the last. As he reached the top, he paused in front of a large portrait of himself, his younger self, standing proudly in a suit. It was a reminder of how far he had come, of the man he had become. But today, it wasn't about the past. It was about the future. He was ready to take control, to show the world that he would not be underestimated again. He took a deep breath, then walked down the long hallway toward his office. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the desk lamp on his mahogany desk. James sat down, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he gathered his thoughts. He was used to making decisions quickly, but this was different. This wasn't just a business move. It was a moment of truth. The door to his office creaked open, and Nia stepped inside. "Everything's set, James. The security team has been notified. Richard and his team are being escorted off the premises as we speak." James looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Good. I want to make sure they understand that this isn't just about firing them. It's about accountability." Nia nodded, her expression serious. "Of course. And we've also flagged Richard's previous incidents. There's a history of behavior. Like this, James." James leaned back in his chair, his hands folding together in front of him. He wasn't surprised. He had expected it. This wasn't the first time he had encountered racial prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last. But he had learned something valuable from this experience. Power wasn't about money or status. It was about presence, about making people understand that you would not be moved, that your space was yours to command. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the estate. The sky was now dark, but the lights of the mansion twinkled in the distance, reflecting his ambition. "Send a message to the board. I want them to know exactly what happened today," he said. "And I want them to know what happens when someone disrespects me." Nia didn't ask any questions. She knew exactly what he meant. She nodded and walked out of the office, leaving James to stand in the silence of his mansion. The silence that was about to be shattered by the consequences of one man's actions. James walked over to his desk and picked up the phone once more. He dialed the number of the head of security. "I need a full review of the team. I'm not just making a change here. I'm setting a standard," he said, his voice steady. "Anyone who can't meet that standard is out." The line went quiet for a moment before the head of security responded. "Understood, Mr. Carter." James hung up the phone and looked around his office one last time. The change was coming. He was going to make sure of it. And when it was all over, no one would ever question his place again. Not at his gate, not in his mansion, not anywhere. He was James Carter, CEO, owner, and a man who demanded respect. James Carter stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his gaze fixed on the sprawling view of the estate. The night had settled in, but the glow of the mansion's lights flickered in the distance, reflecting his ambition. His mind raced with the events of the day, but he pushed them aside for now. This wasn't just about a momentary insult. It was about sending a message that no one, no matter how powerful, could treat him like an outsider. James had worked too hard for this life, and no one was going to strip it away from him. The soft hum of the mansion surrounded him, a constant reminder of everything he had built. But even in the silence, James knew that something had to change. He had to act. He pulled out his phone again and quickly dialed Nia. "I want to meet with the head of security in the morning," James said, his tone calm but resolute. "Get everything ready. I need to know exactly who's been working here and what they've been doing. And make sure we have the full details of Richard's behavior logged, every single incident. I don't care how long it takes." Nia didn't hesitate. "Understood, James. I'll handle it." He hung up and walked out of his office, his footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. As he moved through the mansion, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The quiet strength he had built over the years was about to be tested. But he was ready. He had always been ready. The next morning, James sat in his private conference room, a large mahogany table stretched out in front of him. He was joined by Nia and the head of security, a stern man named John, who had been with James for years. Nia sat at the table, her laptop open, ready to present the details. John stood next to the large windows, his arms folded as he waited for instructions. James looked at both of them, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. "We have a problem," James said, his voice cutting through the room. "Richard wasn't just a one-off mistake. We need to take a hard look at the entire security team. I want everyone's background checked, everyone's behavior reviewed. I don't care if they've been here for a decade. If anyone is undermining this place, if anyone is treating guests differently based on their appearance or any other reason, they're out." Nia typed furiously on her laptop, quickly pulling up the files. "I've already started the review, James. Richard's incidents were more frequent than we realized. We found reports of similar behavior in the past, including his treatment of a few high-profile guests." James nodded, his mind already running through the next steps. "I don't want any more surprises. I want transparency from this point forward. No more tolerance for this kind of behavior." He paused for a moment, looking out the window. And I want the whole team to know what's happening. Let them know that their actions have consequences. John spoke up for the first time, his voice low but steady. We'll do a full audit of every staff member, James. I'll make sure the team understands the new standard. James looked at him, his eyes sharp. I want a formal meeting with the entire security team. I'll address them myself. We're going to set the record straight. Nia looked up from her laptop, her fingers still tapping. I've already scheduled it. The meeting's set for this afternoon. James stood up, a faint smile crossing his face. Good. Let's make sure they understand exactly who they're working for. Later that day, James walked into the security office, his presence filling the room as he entered. The entire security team was gathered, their attention focused on him. James didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, letting his presence speak for itself. The room fell silent. I want to make something very clear, James began, his voice calm but unwavering. This is my estate, and I will not tolerate anyone who undermines it, whether it's with their actions, their words, or their behavior. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I don't care how long any of you have been here. If you can't respect the people who walk through these gates, if you can't treat them with the dignity they deserve, then you don't belong here. Understand. The team remained silent, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. James didn't break eye contact. This is not just about policy. It's about values. It's about respect. And if you can't uphold those values, then I will make sure you're no longer part of this team. He turned to Nia, who was standing by the door, her expression unreadable. Make sure everyone gets the message. No exceptions. Nia nodded and stepped forward, her voice calm and professional. The review will be completed by the end of the day. Anyone who doesn't meet the new standard will be notified immediately. James turned and walked out of the room, his steps purposeful. As he made his way back to his office, he knew this was just the beginning. The changes he was making would echo far beyond this mansion. He was setting a new standard, not just for his employees, but for anyone who dared to challenge him. And he wouldn't stop until that standard was upheld. James sat back at his desk, staring out the window once again. The mansion, the estate, it all belonged to him. But it wasn't just about ownership. It was about respect, about power, and about making sure that no one could take that from him. He wasn't just fighting for his legacy, he was fighting for what was right. He had come too far to let it slip away now. As the sun began to set again, casting a golden hue over the grounds, James knew that the road ahead would be tough. But he was ready. He had always been ready. The following day, the security review was in full swing. James sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the city skyline, the early morning sunlight streaming through the windows. He had made his decision, and now it was time to follow through. Every detail was being scrutinized, and he was ensuring that no stone was left unturned. Nia entered the room, her footsteps soft but purposeful. She walked over to James's desk and stood there for a moment, waiting for him to acknowledge her. James, she said, her voice calm, the full report is ready. James turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Let's hear it. He replied, his tone steady. Nia sat down and opened her laptop, clicking through the documents that had been gathered over the past 24 hours. Richard's behavior was just the beginning. We've identified a pattern with several others on the team. Subtle but consistent bias, treating people differently based on how they look, their appearance, and even their race. James leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. He wasn't surprised. He had suspected as much. The problem wasn't just one person. It was a system that allowed these behaviors to thrive unchecked. What are we doing about it? He asked. Nia looked up from the screen, her eyes meeting his. I've already taken the necessary steps. We've flagged every employee who has shown any sign of this behavior. They're being removed from their posts for now while we conduct a full audit of the security team. James nodded. Good, but I want to do more. I want this to be a wake-up call, a complete overhaul. Nia's eyebrows raised slightly. You're talking about firing more people? James shook his head. Not just firing them. I want to make sure they understand why they're being let go. This isn't just about bad behavior. It's about accountability. I want them to know that they won't be allowed to get away with it anymore. This goes beyond security. It's about the culture of this entire place. Nia took a moment to absorb his words. She knew James was serious, but this felt like a step further than they had gone before. Understood. I'll prepare the necessary documents and make sure the team understands what's happening. James gave a small nod. Make sure it's clear that this is a turning point. I want everyone who works here to know that I will not tolerate discrimination in any form, in any capacity. Nia stood up, closing the laptop with a soft click. I'll take care of it, James. We'll make sure it's handled with the seriousness it deserves. As Nia left the room, James sat back in his chair once again, his mind racing with the implications of what was about to happen. He had come to realize that leadership wasn't just about power. It was about setting the example. And right now, he was setting one. He had worked too hard to get here, to let the foundation of his empire be shaken by the ignorance and bias of a few individuals. He wasn't going to let that happen. He stood up from his desk, walking over to the large windows that overlooked his estate. The grounds were quiet, peaceful even, but he knew the storm was coming. The changes he was implementing would shake things up, but it was necessary. The silence in his office matched the stillness outside, but he knew that would soon change. The next morning, James called for an all-staff meeting. He stood at the front of the room, facing a group of employees from various departments: security, maintenance, management, and support staff. They looked at him with varying degrees of curiosity and uncertainty. James knew that they were wondering what this meeting was about, but he wasn't about to sugarcoat it. He was done with pretending that things were fine when they clearly weren't. I called you all here today because I want to address something that has been a problem in this company for too long. James began, his voice firm and clear. This is a company that values respect, integrity, and fairness. And we are all here to work together to uphold those values. But there are individuals within this team who have allowed bias to influence their actions, who have treated others unfairly because of their race, their appearance, or any other factor that has no place in this company. He paused, letting his words sink in. This is not just about one or two mistakes. This is about a culture that has been allowed to grow unchecked, and I will no longer tolerate it. The room was silent, save for the soft shuffle of feet. James could feel the tension building, but he wasn't backing down. We are going to make changes. There will be no more tolerance for this kind of behavior. We will be conducting a full review of everyone's actions, and anyone who is found to have acted inappropriately will be held accountable. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting those of the employees who had been complicit. He wasn't afraid to call them out. I don't care how long you've been here, how high up you are, or what your role is. If you cannot respect the people who work here, if you cannot treat others with dignity, then you are no longer welcome in this company. The tension in the room was palpable now, and James knew he had their attention. We are going to rebuild this company, starting from the ground up. If you want to be a part of it, then you need to prove that you can live up to the values that this company was built on. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. The change starts today. If you're not on board, you will not be here tomorrow. The room was silent, and James could see the realization dawning on their faces. Some of them shifted uncomfortably, while others stared at him in disbelief. He didn't care. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to make sure that the right people were in the right places and that the wrong people were removed. I expect nothing less than the highest standards from each and every one of you. Do I make myself clear? The room echoed with a hesitant murmur of agreement, and James turned on his heel, walking out of the room without another word. As he made his way back to his office, he knew the changes would come at a cost. People would be upset, some would resist, but he was ready. He had already made the decision, and nothing was going to stand in his way. James Carter had always been a man of action, and today he was proving that no one, no matter their position or tenure, was untouchable when it came to the core values of his company. The following days moved quickly. James had set the wheels in motion, and now he watched as the changes unfolded before him. The review process was in full swing, and employees who had been flagged for inappropriate behavior were quietly escorted out of their roles, one by one. The security team, which had once operated with a sense of unchecked power, was now under scrutiny. James had made it clear there would be no tolerance for bias, no tolerance for anyone who thought they could undermine the integrity of the company. He stood in his office, looking over the reports that came in each day. Nia was invaluable, keeping everything in order, ensuring that no detail was overlooked. She had kept him informed, and now she stood in front of him once again, her expression focused but calm. James, we've completed the audit, Nia said, her voice measured. The results are in. James looked up from his desk, his eyes steady. What did we find? A lot more than we expected, Nia replied. It's not just the security team. There are employees in other departments as well. People who have been subtly undermining the culture here, passing judgment based on appearance, race, even the way people speak. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation settling in. This was never just about security, was it? He said softly. Nia shook her head. No, it's systemic. And it goes deeper than we realized. James took a deep breath. This wasn't just a matter of firing a few people. This was about changing the culture of the entire company. He had always believed in building something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. But now, it was clear that the foundation needed to be reinforced. What's the next step? James asked, his tone resolute. Nia didn't hesitate. I've already drafted a company-wide statement. We're going to address this head-on. We're going to make it clear that this company will not tolerate discrimination in any form, and that anyone who doesn't uphold these values will be removed. James nodded. Good. Let's send it out. The next day, the message went out to all employees. The statement was simple, but its impact was powerful. We are committed to fostering an inclusive, respectful environment for all employees, clients, and guests. Effective immediately, we will be conducting ongoing evaluations to ensure that these values are upheld. Anyone found to be in violation will be removed from their position and subject to further action. This is non-negotiable. James knew this wouldn't be an easy transition. There would be resistance, and there would be those who would try to challenge his authority. But he was ready. This was the cost of progress. The days that followed were filled with meetings, interviews, and difficult decisions. James found himself addressing groups of employees, answering tough questions, and explaining the importance of what they were doing. There were moments when he felt the weight of the responsibility bearing down on him, but he never wavered. His vision for the company was clear. This wasn't just about correcting the mistakes of the past, it was about shaping the future. As the weeks passed, the changes began to take hold. The security team was restructured, with a focus on diversity and inclusion training. Employees from all departments were given new guidelines to follow, with an emphasis on respect and accountability. The company's culture slowly began to shift, and it was evident in the way people interacted with one another. James watched it all unfold with a sense of pride, but also with a quiet determination. He knew this was only the beginning. There would be more work to do, more people to educate, more policies to enforce. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. One afternoon, as James sat in his office, reviewing a new report, there was a knock on the door. Come in, he called out. Nia entered, her expression thoughtful. James, there's someone here to see you, she said. A former employee. James raised an eyebrow. A former employee, he repeated. What do they want? Nia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing the person to enter. The man who walked in was tall, with a clean-cut appearance, dressed in a suit that looked out of place in the modern, sleek office. James recognized him immediately. It was Richard, the security guard who had first blocked him at the gate. James stood up, his gaze sharp but calm. Richard, he said, his voice steady. What brings you here? Richard hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. I know I made a mistake, he said, his voice low. I've had time to think about it, and I wanted to come in and apologize. I didn't realize who you were. I've been dealing with some personal issues, but that's no excuse for the way I treated you. James studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Richard's face. There was something different about him now, something that wasn't there before. Perhaps it was the realization that he had been wrong, or perhaps it was something deeper. But James wasn't interested in excuses. He had seen enough of that in his life. Apologies are a start, James said, his voice measured. But actions speak louder than words. What are you going to do about it? Richard looked down for a moment, then met James' gaze again. I've already started, he said. I've been taking courses, learning about unconscious bias, and how to create a more inclusive environment. I want to do better. James nodded slowly. I appreciate your willingness to change. But that doesn't change the fact that your actions affected the company. Richard swallowed, his eyes filled with regret. I understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to come here and make things right. James regarded him for a moment longer before speaking again. You're not the only one who needs to change, he said. But you have to show me that you're committed. You've got a long way to go, Richard. It's up to you to prove that you can be part of this new culture. Richard nodded solemnly. I will, James. I promise. James didn't offer a smile, but he didn't need to. He could see the sincerity in Richard's eyes. And that was enough for now. As Richard left the room, James turned back to his desk, his thoughts lingering on the conversation. This was a reminder that change wasn't easy. It wasn't always immediate, and it didn't always come in the form of a simple apology. But it was a step in the right direction. And for James, that was enough to keep pushing forward. The company was transforming, and so was he. He had never been more certain of his path. And as the days passed, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Days turned into weeks, and the momentum James had built began to show real results. The changes were noticeable not just in the staff, but in the way the entire company functioned. There was a newfound respect in the air, a subtle shift in the culture that was hard to ignore. James knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time, he felt like he was leading the company in the right direction. However, there were still those who didn't quite understand the full weight of the transformation. One afternoon, James sat in his office, going over the financial reports, when Nia walked in. James, we've received some pushback, she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of the message. From some of the higher-ups. They're not happy with how things are changing so quickly. James didn't look up from the papers in front of him. What kind of pushback? Some are questioning the speed of the changes, Nia continued. They feel like we're moving too fast, that it's disrupting the way things have always been done. James sighed, leaning back in his chair. He had anticipated this. Change was never easy, especially when it challenged long-established systems and hierarchies. Tell them. That change doesn't happen at a comfortable pace, James said, his voice steady. This isn't about convenience. This is about correcting what's been wrong for too long. We're not here to play by the old rules. We're rewriting them. Nia nodded, a slight smile crossing her face. I'll handle it. As Nia left, James turned his attention back to the reports. But his mind wasn't on the numbers anymore. It was on the future of the company, the legacy he was building. He had made tough decisions, but they were necessary. And now, he needed to make sure that every person in the company understood the importance of those decisions. Later that afternoon, James called a meeting with the senior leadership team. The room was filled with tense faces, the air thick with unspoken tension. James sat at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the group. I called this meeting because we need to address something important, he began. We are at a crossroads. The changes we've implemented are not just about policies or procedures. They are about the core values of this company. And I will not stand by while anyone questions those values. There was a pause, as the room absorbed his words. James continued, his voice firm and unwavering. If you are not on board with the direction we are going, then I need you to leave. Now, I will not have anyone here who isn't committed to making this company better, who isn't willing to fight for respect, equality, and integrity. One of the senior managers, a man named Alan, shifted in his seat. He had been with the company for over a decade, and his discomfort was palpable. James, I understand what you're trying to do, but these changes are happening too fast. We're used to a certain way of doing things, and this is disrupting everything. James met Alan's gaze, his eyes steady and resolute. You're right. Things are changing. They need to change. And if you can't adapt, then you're not the right person for this company. Alan opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. I'm not asking for anyone's approval. I'm telling you that this is happening. And if you're not ready to be part of that, then you're free to go. But if you choose to stay, you need to understand one thing. We don't tolerate discrimination, and we never will again. Not in this company, not under my watch. Alan looked around the room, his face flushed with a mix of anger and realization. He glanced at the others seated around the table, but no one spoke. No one offered support. James could feel the tension shift in the room. They were either going to stand with him or not. And from the looks on their faces, they knew there was no turning back. Alan finally broke the silence, his voice low. I'll stay, he said, but I don't know how this is all going to work. James nodded, his expression softening slightly. It won't be easy, but we'll work through it together. Everyone here needs to understand that respect is non-negotiable. If you can't live by that standard, then we can't work together. The room was still for a moment before another manager, Sarah, spoke up. I understand, James. I'm on board with the changes. James gave her a nod of approval. Good. I'm glad to hear that. He looked around the room at the others. Anyone else? One by one, the other senior leaders voiced their support. It was clear that the change was not only inevitable but necessary. When the meeting finally ended, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. This was a turning point. The resistance had been loud, but now the team was finally starting to come around. They had no choice but to adapt, to evolve with the times. James stood up and walked out of the room, feeling the weight of the responsibility lift slightly. But as he passed the hallway, he spotted Nia standing near the door. She was waiting for him. "The board's on board, James," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "They're officially backing the changes." James felt a surge of pride, but he didn't let it show. "Good. Now let's keep pushing. We've got a lot of work to do." Nia nodded. "We're ready." James turned and walked toward his office, his mind already moving to the next step. The changes were happening. The company was evolving, and he was leading the charge, no matter the cost. He had always known that progress wasn't easy, but with every step forward, he felt more confident that this was the right path. He wasn't just changing a company. He was changing lives, creating a legacy that would outlast him, and no one could take that away from him. James sat in his office late one evening, the city lights twinkling below as he looked out the window. The weight of the decisions he had made, the changes that had taken place, was finally beginning to settle in. For weeks, he had watched as the company adapted, as employees slowly but surely aligned with his vision. The resistance he had faced in the beginning was still present in some corners, but it was now becoming less of a threat and more of a distant memory. It wasn't easy, and it hadn't been fast, but the company was evolving. And James felt that quiet pride creeping in, the kind that comes when you know you're on the right path. He turned his attention back to the reports on his desk, each one a reminder of the work still to be done. The company was making strides, but there were still gaps, still areas where change needed to be deeper, more ingrained. And James wasn't going to stop until he was sure every part of the company reflected the values he had fought so hard to instill. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his train of thought. It was Nia. "James, we've got another situation," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "What now?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "One of the senior managers, Marcus, has raised concerns about the direction we're taking. He's not happy with the pace of the changes, and he's questioning the long-term impact on the company's bottom line." James felt a surge of frustration, but he didn't let it show. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "We're moving forward. Tell him to either get on board or step aside." "I already did," Nia replied. "But he's pushing for a meeting with you. He wants to discuss his concerns in person." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the desk. "Fine. Set it up. I'll speak with him." The next day, Marcus, the senior manager, walked into James's office. His posture was stiff, and there was a noticeable tension in the air. He wasn't here to apologize, and he wasn't here to compromise. He was here to challenge James. "James, I think you're making a huge mistake," Marcus began, his voice firm, but respectful. "These changes you're pushing, they're too fast, and they're too risky. We're a business, not a social experiment. You can't just turn everything upside down and expect it to work." James stood up from behind his desk, his gaze unwavering. "I've heard enough of this," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of authority. "I'm not making mistakes. What we're doing is necessary. This company has been built on outdated ideas and biases for too long. I'm not going to sit back and let that continue." Marcus crossed his arms, clearly frustrated. "And you think alienating half the company is the way to fix it? The people who have been here for years, who've kept things running. You can't just expect everyone to follow along with these changes without question." "No," James replied. "I don't expect everyone to follow blindly. But I do expect everyone to respect the values we're putting in place. If they can't do that, then maybe they don't belong here." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, but James cut him off. "We're not debating this. The changes are happening, and they are going to make this company better in the long run. If you can't see that, then you're free to leave." Marcus stood there for a moment, his jaw clenched. He clearly didn't like what he was hearing, but James wasn't about to back down. "You can either get on board and help me make this happen, or you can step aside. The choice is yours." There was a long silence before Marcus finally spoke. "I'll stay," he said, his voice tight. "But I'm not happy about it." James nodded. "Good. Now get to work." As Marcus left the office, James felt a sense of finality. He had made it clear where he stood, and he wasn't going to let anyone derail the progress they had made. But he also knew that Marcus's attitude wasn't unique. There would be others who would challenge him, who would resist the changes he was trying to implement. And that was fine. It would only make him push harder. A few days later, James sat in his office, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. The company was moving in the right direction, but the road ahead was still long. There were still people to convince, systems to overhaul, and attitudes to change. But as he looked out at the city below, he couldn't help but feel that sense of calm that came with knowing you were on the right path. The phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time, it was Nia. "James, I have good news," she said, her voice light. "The board meeting is set for next week. They've reviewed everything, and they're on board with the changes. They're ready to give you their full support." James smiled to himself, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. This was the moment he had been working for, the validation that he was doing the right thing, that the vision he had for the company was shared by those at the highest levels. "That's great," James said, his voice steady. "Make sure they understand that this is just the beginning. We're not stopping here. We're going to keep pushing, keep evolving, until this company reflects the world we want to see." "I'll make sure of it," Nia replied. "I'll send over the final agenda for the meeting later today." James hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, a sense of accomplishment settling in. He had come a long way from that first moment at the gate, when he was turned away from his own property. But now, he had the support he needed to make the changes that would shape the company's future. He wasn't done yet, though. The real work was just beginning. James knew that if he was going to leave a legacy, it had to be one built on integrity, respect, and fairness. And he would make sure that everyone who worked for him knew that this wasn't just a company. It was a community, a place where everyone had a voice, and everyone was valued. And as the days passed, James felt more certain than ever that he was on the right path. The changes were taking root, and the company was becoming what he had always envisioned. A place where respect wasn't just a word, but a way of life. The day of the board meeting arrived. James walked into the sleek conference room, the large oak table gleaming beneath the bright lights. His team was already seated, their faces a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The moment he entered, all eyes turned to him. James stood at the front of the room, his posture straight, his presence undeniable. He knew this was it, the moment when everything would either solidify or crumble. He cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Thank you all for being here today. I know the last few months have been challenging, but we are at a critical point in our journey. The changes we've implemented are not just about improving the company. They're about reshaping the very foundation on which this company stands. Respect, integrity, and inclusion are no longer just words in a policy. They are the core of everything we do." He paused, letting his words settle in the room. "We've made incredible strides, but there's still work to be done. We are at the start of something much bigger than just company reform. We're leading the way in creating a new standard for how businesses should operate. And I need each of you to be part of that." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each board member. Some of them were nodding, others were silent, processing what he had just said. But James could feel the shift. The resistance that had once been so strong was now beginning to fade. The board was coming around. The meeting continued, with updates from various departments about the progress they had made in implementing the new values. There were reports of employees stepping up, engaging in conversations about inclusion, and making changes in their own teams. James felt a sense of satisfaction as he listened to the stories of transformation. But he wasn't about to let his guard down. He had come too far to stop now. As the meeting came to a close, the board members began to speak up, voicing their support for the changes James had pushed for. One by one, they offered their approval, their commitment to the new direction. "James," said Emily, the chairwoman of the board, "I want to acknowledge the hard work you've put into this. I know it hasn't been easy, and I know there are still challenges ahead, but we are fully behind you. This company is stronger because of the changes you've made." James nodded, his expression neutral. "Thank you, Emily. But this is just the beginning. We've set the groundwork, but now we need to build on it. We need to ensure that this culture of respect is woven into every level of the company, from the ground up." He let the room absorb his words before continuing. "We can't afford to become complacent. We have to keep pushing forward, and we have to hold each other accountable. The change we're creating will not be sustainable if we let up, and I won't let that happen." The room was quiet, and James could see the respect in the eyes of the board members. They understood what was at stake. They understood the gravity of the transformation James was leading. "I will be relying on each of you to help lead this company into the future," he said. "We have an opportunity to not just be a successful business, but a business that sets an example. A company that values its people, that treats them with dignity and respect. I expect nothing less from all of you." The board meeting ended shortly after, but James didn't feel a sense of finality. He knew there was still much to be done. As he walked out of the room, his mind was already racing with thoughts of the next steps. The company was on the right path, but now it was time to keep pushing, to ensure that the changes took root and became ingrained in the company's culture. That evening, as James sat in his office, he reflected on how far they had come. The challenges he had faced, the obstacles he had overcome, it had all led to this moment. But the job wasn't finished. He still had to hold everyone to the standard they had set. And more importantly, he had to ensure that the company continued to grow, continued to evolve, and that it would never go back to the way it had been. James had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let that happen. The next day, James addressed the entire company in a live video call. The employees watched from their screens, and James knew that this was the moment to reinforce everything they had been working toward. "Good morning, everyone," James began, his voice calm but commanding. "I want to take a moment to thank each of you for your dedication and hard work over the last few months. We have made tremendous progress, and I am incredibly proud of what we've accomplished together. But there's one thing I need to make clear. This is not a one-time change. This is not something we can just check off a list. This is a new way of doing things, a new culture that we are building together, and it's a culture that is rooted in respect for one another, in accountability, in inclusivity." James paused, letting his words sink in. "I know that this journey hasn't been easy. I know that some of you have struggled with the pace of change, and I understand that. But I also know that this is the right path. We are creating a company where everyone has a voice, where every person is valued for who they are, not for how they look or where they come from. And I need each of you to continue to uphold that." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes unwavering. "This is my promise to you. I will not let this company fall back into old habits. I will not let anyone take us backward. We are moving forward, and we will continue to move forward together." James ended the call, his gaze still fixed on the screen for a moment. The room was quiet, but he felt a sense of peace wash over him. This was the right decision. He had no doubt. As the company continued to grow and evolve, James knew that they would face new challenges. But he also knew that they had created something stronger than just a business. They had built a community, and that was something that no one could take away from them. He sat back in his chair, a quiet smile on his face. This was the beginning of something truly extraordinary. Weeks passed, and the changes James had implemented began to take root. The company had gone through a complete transformation, from the leadership team to every employee at every level. The atmosphere had shifted. Where once there had been tension and resistance, there was now a sense of unity and purpose. James stood in front of a large window in his office, watching as the city stretched out beneath him. The skyline glimmered under the fading light of day, a perfect reflection of the world he was building. But he knew that the real test was yet to come. It wasn't enough to just change policies or fire a few employees who didn't meet the new standards. The true challenge was ensuring that this new culture, one of respect, integrity, and inclusion, was embedded in every fiber of the company. He couldn't let up, not now. He had to lead by example, every day, in every interaction. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his thoughts. It was Nia. "James, the quarterly meeting is tomorrow," she said. "I think it's time for you to address the entire company again. The last time you spoke to them, you made it clear that this transformation was just beginning. It's time to remind them of what we've accomplished and where we're headed." James thought for a moment. "You're right," he replied. "But I need to make sure this time is different. It's not just about what we've done. It's about showing them how far we've come and the path we're going to continue down. We've set the bar, but now we need to make sure everyone is committed to maintaining it." The next day, the room was filled with employees from every department: management, support, security, and operations. They all gathered in the company's main auditorium, seated in neat rows, their faces a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. James walked to the front of the room, the weight of the moment settling in. He had led the company through so much change, but now, it was time to reaffirm their commitment to the values they had worked so hard to instill. As he stood in front of them, he took a moment to let the silence linger. The entire room was waiting. He knew that the words he spoke now would either solidify everything they had worked for or risk undoing it. When I first addressed all of you, I told you that we were at a crossroads. James began, his voice calm but powerful. I told you that the changes we were making weren't just about policies, they were about culture. About creating a company that values respect above all else. A company that listens, that learns, and that adapts. He paused, scanning the room. And we've done that. We've made real, tangible progress. We've removed the obstacles that were standing in our way. We've turned around a culture that was, for far too long, mired in outdated practices. But that's not enough. James's eyes locked with those of a few employees in the room, making sure they understood the gravity of his words. The world doesn't stand still, and neither can we. We cannot afford to be complacent. We cannot let the progress we've made be the end of our story. We have to keep moving forward, keep pushing ourselves to be better, to be more inclusive, to lead with integrity in everything we do. A sense of weight hung in the room as his words sank in. He could see the faces of the employees around the room shift. Some were nodding, others were reflecting. But he knew they all understood what he was saying. They were all on the same page now. We've set the standard, James continued, but maintaining it is just as important as setting it. If we let up now, if we stop holding each other accountable, then all of this, the culture we've built, the values we've put in place, will be meaningless. He took a deep breath, his voice unwavering. So, I'm asking each of you to hold yourselves accountable, to hold each other accountable. We have to be vigilant. We have to ensure that we continue to live these values every single day, no exceptions. And if you see something that isn't right, if you see someone slipping back into old habits, I need you to step up. I need you to speak out. The room was silent for a moment before a voice from the back called out. We're with you, James. We're in this together. A wave of agreement rippled through the room, and James felt a sense of pride wash over him. This was it. This was the moment he had been working for. They were all on board. Good, James said, his voice filled with conviction. Together, we can make sure that this company isn't just successful, but a beacon of what's possible when respect and integrity are at the core of everything we do. But that only happens if we keep the momentum going. He let the room absorb his words. He could see the energy in their eyes, the fire of commitment that was now shared by everyone in that room. We've created something special here, James continued, his voice softening. But now we have to make sure it lasts. I'm counting on each and every one of you to help me do that. This isn't just my vision anymore. This is all of ours. As the meeting wrapped up, James stood by the door, shaking hands with employees as they left. He could feel the renewed energy in the room, the shared commitment to the future of the company. But as he watched them leave, he couldn't help but think of the road ahead. This was only the beginning. The work they had done was just the foundation. The real challenge was ensuring that the values they had fought for became a permanent part of the company's DNA. And James was ready for that challenge. He had already proven that he could lead with integrity. Now, he had to prove that the company could continue to thrive on that foundation. He wasn't backing down, and he wasn't alone. Together, they would build a company that would stand the test of time, a company that would lead with respect, and a company that would never again let its values be compromised. Weeks passed, and the changes James had implemented began to take root. The company had gone through a complete transformation, from the leadership team to every employee at every level. The atmosphere had shifted. Where once there had been tension and resistance, there was now a sense of unity and purpose. James stood in front of a large window in his office, watching as the city stretched out beneath him. The skyline glimmered under the fading light of day, a perfect reflection of the world he was building. But he knew that the real test was yet to come. It wasn't enough to just change policies or fire a few employees who didn't meet the new standards. The true challenge was ensuring that this new culture, one of respect, integrity, and inclusion, was embedded in every fiber of the company. He couldn't let up, not now. He had to lead by example, every day, in every interaction. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his thoughts. It was Nia. "James, the quarterly meeting is tomorrow," she said. "I think it's time for you to address the entire company again. The last time you spoke to them, you made it clear that this transformation was just beginning. It's time to remind them of what we've accomplished and where we're headed." James thought for a moment. "You're right," he replied. "But I need to make sure this time is different. It's not just about what we've done. It's about showing them how far we've come and the path we're going to continue down. We've set the bar, but now we need to make sure everyone is committed to maintaining it." The next day, the room was filled with employees from every department: management, support, security, and operations. They all gathered in the company's main auditorium, seated in neat rows, their faces a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. James walked to the front of the room, the weight of the moment settling in. He had led the company through so much change, but now, it was time to reaffirm their commitment to the values they had worked so hard to instill. As he stood in front of them, he took a moment to let the silence linger. The entire room was waiting. He knew that the words he spoke now would either solidify everything they had worked for or risk undoing it. "When I first addressed all of you, I told you that we were at a crossroads," James began, his voice calm but powerful. "I told you that the changes we were making weren't just about policies, they were about culture, about creating a company that values respect above all else. A company that listens, that learns, and that adapts." He paused, scanning the room. "And we've done that. We've made real, tangible progress. We've removed the obstacles that were standing in our way. We've turned around a culture that was, for far too long, mired in outdated practices. But that's not enough." James's eyes locked with those of a few employees in the room, making sure they understood the gravity of his words. "The world doesn't stand still, and neither can we. We cannot afford to be complacent. We cannot let the progress we've made be the end of our story. We have to keep moving forward, keep pushing ourselves to be better, to be more inclusive, to lead with integrity in everything we do." A sense of weight hung in the room as his words sank in. He could see the faces of the employees around the room shift. Some were nodding, others were reflecting. But he knew they all understood what he was saying. They were all on the same page now. "We've set the standard," James continued, "but maintaining it is just as important as setting it. If we let up now, if we stop holding each other accountable, then all of this, the culture we've built, the values we've put in place, will be meaningless." He took a deep breath, his voice unwavering. "So, I'm asking each of you to hold yourselves accountable, to hold each other accountable. We have to be vigilant. We have to ensure that we continue to live these values every single day, no exceptions. And if you see something that isn't right, if you see someone slipping back into old habits, I need you to step up. I need you to speak out." The room was silent for a moment before a voice from the back called out, "We're with you, James. We're in this together." A wave of agreement rippled through the room, and James felt a sense of pride wash over him. This was it. This was the moment he had been working for. They were all on board. "Good," James said, his voice filled with conviction. "Together, we can make sure that this company isn't just successful, but a beacon of what's possible when respect and integrity are at the core of everything we do. But that only happens if we keep the momentum going." He let the room absorb his words. He could see the energy in their eyes, the fire of commitment that was now shared by everyone in that room. "We've created something special here," James continued, his voice softening. "But now we have to make sure it lasts. I'm counting on each and every one of you to help me do that. This isn't just my vision anymore. This is all of ours." As the meeting wrapped up, James stood by the door, shaking hands with employees as they left. He could feel the renewed energy in the room, the shared commitment to the future of the company. But as he watched them leave, he couldn't help but think of the road ahead. This was only the beginning. The work they had done was just the foundation. The real challenge was ensuring that the values they had fought for became a permanent part of the company's DNA. And James was ready for that challenge. He had already proven that he could lead with integrity. Now, he had to prove that the company could continue to thrive on that foundation. He wasn't backing down, and he wasn't alone. Together, they would build a company that would stand the test of time, a company that would lead with respect, and a company that would never again let its values be compromised. Months passed since that pivotal board meeting, and the company was flourishing in ways James hadn't even fully anticipated. The changes he had pushed for were taking root across every department, and the once tense and divided atmosphere was now charged with a new energy, an energy built on respect, accountability, and a shared purpose. James sat at his desk, looking over a new round of reports, a sense of satisfaction growing within him as he saw the progress reflected in the numbers. The shift in company culture was clear, employee engagement was up, turnover was down, and the feedback from clients and customers was overwhelmingly positive. It wasn't just the metrics that mattered to James, though. It was the feeling that the company had finally become a place where the values he had always believed in were woven into the fabric of every interaction, every decision. He knew that the real test would always be the long-term sustainability of these changes, and he was determined to make sure they stuck. He leaned back in his chair, eyes briefly closing as he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility lift, if only slightly. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Nia. "James, there's something I think you need to see," she said, her voice calm. But there was an underlying urgency. "What is it?" he asked, sitting up straighter, sensing the shift in her tone. "It's the latest round of employee surveys," Nia replied. "You need to see the feedback coming from the senior managers. Some of them aren't as on board with the changes as we thought. There are whispers about the pace of things, some concerns about the long-term financial impact, and a few are questioning whether these changes are sustainable." James's jaw tightened, but he knew this day would come. "Set up a meeting with them. Now," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "I want to address this head-on." The meeting was set for the following morning. James sat at the head of the long conference table, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. The senior managers were seated, their expressions a mix of skepticism and uncertainty. James had no intention of backing down now, not after everything they had accomplished. "I called this meeting because I've heard concerns about the direction we're heading in," James began, his voice calm but filled with authority. "I've always said that change is necessary, and I've always known that some people wouldn't be happy with it. But I'm not here to back off. I'm here to make sure that we continue to move forward." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "I know that some of you are worried about the speed of these changes, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about doing things the way they've always been done. This isn't about keeping things comfortable for a select few. This is about building a company where everyone feels respected, where we lead by example, and where the work we do matters." One of the senior managers, Alan, spoke up. "James, I get it. I do. But this pace, it's a lot. We're making huge changes in such a short period of time. It's disrupting the way we've always done things, and I'm concerned about how that's going to affect our financials down the road." James nodded slowly, his expression calm. "I hear your concerns, Alan, but I'm going to be blunt. We can't keep running this company like it's 1995. We can't keep ignoring the values that matter most to our employees, to our clients, and to the people who rely on us. This is the future of the company, and we have no choice but to move forward." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but James didn't let up. "If you're not on board with that, if you can't embrace this change, then maybe you're not the right person to help lead this company anymore." The room fell silent. James's words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and he wasn't going to back down. "I'm not here to placate anyone. I'm here to make sure we build something that will last. If you're committed to that, then we move forward together. If you're not, then I'll help you find a way out. This isn't negotiable." The silence stretched on for a few more seconds, but then Emily, another senior manager, spoke. "James," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I understand. I've been skeptical, but I see what you're trying to do now. I see the bigger picture. I'm with you." Slowly, other heads nodded in agreement. One by one, the senior managers voiced their support, their tone shifting from resistance to reluctant acceptance. James listened, but he didn't show any emotion. He knew that the true measure of their commitment wouldn't come from words, it would come from their actions. The meeting ended with a sense of resolution, but James knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to defend the changes he'd fought for. As the managers filed out of the room, Nia stepped in. "How did it go?" she asked. "They'll come around," James said, his voice steady. "It's always tough in the beginning, but they'll see that this is the right way to go." Nia smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear that. I knew you wouldn't back down." James nodded but didn't say anything. He knew that the work was far from over. There would be more challenges, more resistance, more moments when he'd have to push harder than ever before. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right path. The company was changing, and he was leading it into a future that was brighter, more inclusive, and more successful than ever before. And he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. Not now, not ever. As the weeks passed, James felt a deep sense of accomplishment, but he knew that true success wasn't just about making changes. It was about making sure those changes lasted. The company was moving forward, but there was still much work to be done. The senior leadership had finally come around, and the resistance within the company had faded, but James was keenly aware that this transformation wasn't just about changing systems. It was about changing mindsets. He had already set the foundation, but it was up to everyone else to build on it. James sat at his desk, reviewing the latest progress reports. Employee morale was at an all-time high, client satisfaction was improving, and the company's bottom line had seen a noticeable increase. Yet, in the quiet of his office, he felt a nagging sense that he wasn't done. He had always believed in the power of continual growth and improvement, and now, with the company running smoothly, it was time to turn his attention outward. The world was watching, and he had to make sure that the message he had set in motion was one that would ripple out beyond the walls of his office, beyond the company, and into the broader community. He stood up from his desk and walked over to the large windows. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The view from his office was breathtaking, but it was more than just the cityscape that held his attention now. It was the realization that what he had started wasn't just about financial success. It was about leaving a legacy that would inspire others to lead with integrity, to prioritize respect and accountability in every aspect of their lives. James had always known that leadership came with a responsibility. He had built his empire from the ground up, but now, the work was about more than just building wealth. It was about shaping a culture, not only within his company, but also in the world at large. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Nia. "James, I've just received the feedback from the latest round of client surveys. There's something we need to discuss." James raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "It's good news, mostly," Nia said. "But there's a concern from a few of our high-profile clients. They're noticing the changes in the company's culture, and some are wondering if it's affecting our ability to deliver results in the way we used to." James frowned slightly. "What do they mean?" "They're not questioning the values, but some feel like we've become too focused on internal changes," Nia explained. "They want reassurance that we can maintain the same level of performance and attention to detail while also staying true to the new culture." James thought for a moment. It wasn't a surprise. Whenever you make sweeping changes, there are always going to be those who worry about the impact on results. Tell them we're not going to compromise on either. We can be a company that values respect and integrity and still deliver the highest level of performance, he said, his tone steady. "I'll personally address it." The following day, James gathered the senior leadership team for a meeting. He knew that his next move would be crucial. He had to ensure that everyone understood the importance of balancing cultural change with the company's goals. He walked into the conference room, his presence commanding attention. "We've made incredible progress," James began, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "But we're at a point where we need to make sure that the changes we've made don't compromise the very things that made us successful in the first place." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Our clients trust us because we deliver results. We can't forget that. But we also can't lose sight of the values that are at the heart of everything we do. We have to prove that we can do both." The room was silent as the leaders around the table processed his words. James wasn't asking for a choice between the two. He was asking for both. "I need everyone here to make sure that our commitment to respect, to integrity, to accountability is reflected in every client interaction, every project, and every decision we make. But I also need you to ensure that we are performing at the highest level. We can't let one slip in favor of the other." The senior managers nodded in agreement, understanding the gravity of what James was asking. They had all seen the changes James had led within the company, and they understood that he wasn't asking them to abandon the transformation they had all worked so hard to build. He was asking them to embody the balance between these values and performance. "I'm not asking for perfection," James continued, "but I am asking for commitment. I want every single person in this company to know that they don't have To choose between being successful and being ethical. We can have both. And if we get this right, if we stay true to our values while continuing to push for excellence, we will lead this industry in ways no one has ever imagined. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The senior team was on board, and James felt confident that they would rise to the challenge. But he knew that this was just the beginning. The real work lay in ensuring that these ideals were consistently applied across the company. Over the next few weeks, James spent his time traveling to various departments, checking in on the progress, and making sure the changes were being embraced at every level. He was always hands-on, always making sure that the message he had preached from the beginning, the message of respect, integrity, and performance, was being carried out by everyone. One afternoon, while in a meeting with a team in the marketing department, James received a call from Nia. "James, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice a bit cautious. "It's Richard." James frowned. "Richard? Why is he here?" "He says he has something important to discuss with you," Nia replied. "I think you should hear him out." Richard, the same man who had blocked him at the gate, the one who had been given a second chance. James had expected that the issue was settled, but now here he was again. "Send him in," James said, his voice even. The door opened, and Richard stepped inside. He looked different than the last time James had seen him. There was no defensiveness in his posture, no arrogance in his eyes. He seemed humbled. "James," Richard began, his voice steady but unsure. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and I know I made mistakes. But I also know that what you're doing here, what you've built, it's something special. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because I want to help." James regarded him for a moment before speaking. "Help with what?" "I want to be part of this transformation," Richard said. "I want to make up for the mistakes I made. I want to show you that I'm committed to these values." James didn't speak right away. He could see the sincerity in Richard's eyes, the genuine desire to be part of the change. James had always believed in second chances, and perhaps this was the opportunity to turn things around completely. "I'm willing to give you that chance," James said, his voice calm but firm. "But you have to prove it. You have to show me that you're ready to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And if you can do that, we'll see where it goes." Richard nodded, a quiet determination in his gaze. "I won't let you down, James." James stood up, offering a firm handshake. "Then let's get to work." This was a moment of true transformation, not just for the company, but for Richard as well. James knew that the road ahead would continue to be challenging, but he felt confident that he had the right people by his side to lead the way. This was what leadership was truly about, giving others the opportunity to grow, to change, and to rise to the occasion. And as James looked toward the future, he knew that he wasn't just shaping a company. He was shaping a new world of possibilities. The weeks following Richard's meeting with James proved to be pivotal for both of them. Richard had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. He immersed himself in learning, attending every training session on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias that the company offered. James watched as Richard's transformation began to unfold. He was no longer the defensive man who had once blocked James at the gate. Instead, he was someone who was working to understand the very values the company had been built on. James couldn't deny the shift in him. However, there was still work to be done. Richard was just one part of the broader effort to ensure that every employee was fully committed to the new company culture. James knew the success of the company's transformation rested on more than just individual efforts. It rested on the collective effort of the entire workforce. And so, James spent even more time engaging with his team, meeting with departments, talking to employees at all levels, reinforcing the message of respect and accountability. He was always present, always reminding them that the values they were building weren't just policies, they were a way of life. One afternoon, James gathered the senior leadership team for an update on how things were going. He stood in front of the group, his posture confident, but his expression thoughtful. "We've made a lot of progress," James began, looking around the room. "But we cannot rest on our laurels. We've implemented the changes, we've set new standards, but now we have to make sure that we keep up with them. We can't afford to let complacency creep in." Alan, one of the senior managers who had initially expressed concerns about the pace of change, spoke up. "James, I've seen the changes, and I agree. But we also need to make sure that our performance stays strong. Our clients are still watching, and we need to ensure that the quality of service we provide doesn't slip in the process. James nodded. You're right. The work we've done is just the foundation. We cannot let our values compromise the quality of our service. But we can't let the need for performance overshadow the values that make us different from the companies that only care about profit. We have to find a balance. Emily, another senior leader, added, what I've seen so far is promising. Employees are more engaged, and the culture is shifting. But we need to double down on making sure that this isn't just a passing trend. We have to embed these values in every decision we make. James paused for a moment, letting their words sink in. Exactly, he said. This is about consistency. We've set the bar, but we have to live up to it every day. Every decision, every interaction, every meeting. It all has to reflect the culture we're building. We cannot afford to slip back into old habits. We have to keep pushing. The leadership team agreed, and they began discussing ways to ensure that the changes they had worked so hard to implement would be sustainable in the long run. James could see the commitment in their eyes. This was no longer about changing a few policies. It was about creating a lasting legacy. That evening, as James sat at his desk, going over the details of the meeting, he received another call from Nia. James, I just got off the phone with some of our clients, she said. They're very pleased with the changes they've seen. But there are a few more concerns I think you need to address. What are they? James asked, not surprised. They want to know how we're going to ensure that this transformation sticks, Nia explained. They're seeing the results now, but they want reassurance that we're not just doing this for show. They want to know that this company is truly committed to these values for the long haul. James took a deep breath. He understood the concern. Tell them that we're committed to this for the long term, he said. This isn't a short-term project. This is who we are now, and we're making sure it's built into the DNA of everything we do. I'll personally send them an update. Nia agreed and ended the call. James sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. The pressure was on, but he was ready. He knew that the work they were doing was far from finished. But as he looked out of his office window at the city below, he felt a sense of resolve. This wasn't just about changing a company. This was about leading a movement. The next morning, James drafted a personal letter to send to the clients who had expressed concern. He emphasized the company's ongoing commitment to the values they had embraced and outlined the steps they were taking to ensure that the cultural shift would be permanent. He knew that they needed reassurance, but he also knew that actions spoke louder than words. The letter was sent, but James wasn't waiting for a response. He was already looking ahead to the next challenge. Over the next few weeks, the company continued to evolve. The transformation was visible, not just in the way people interacted with one another, but in the way the company did business. Employees were no longer simply working for a paycheck. They were working for something bigger. They were part of a company that valued their contributions, that respected their individuality, and that held them accountable for the success of the business as a whole. James knew that, while the change was evident, the real work was in making sure that every employee, from the front desk to the boardroom, lived the values they had set. And for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that they would. The transformation wasn't just about shifting policies. It was about creating a culture that would sustain itself, a culture that would weather whatever challenges the future brought. James wasn't just leading a company. He was building something that would last. And as he looked around at the people he had surrounded himself with, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. The future was bright, and together, they would shape it.